Moon madness. A touch of fever. I wish I could think so. But when I am alone after dark in the waste places where my wanderings take me, and hear across infinite voids the demon echoes of those screams and snarls, and that detestable crunching of bones, I shudder again at the memory of that eldritch night. I knew less of woodcraft in those days, though the wilderness called just as strongly to me as it does now. Up to that night I had always been careful to employ a guide, but circumstances now suddenly forced me to a trial of my own skill. It was midsummer in Maine, and despite my great need to get from Mayfair to Glendale by the next noon, I could find no person willing to pilot me. Unless I took the long route through Pottawissit, which would not bring me to my goal in time, there would be dense forests to penetrate, yet whenever I asked for a guide I was met with refusal and evasion. Stranger that I was, it seemed odd that everyone should have such glib excuses. There was too much important business on hand for such a sleepy village, and I knew that the natives were lying. But they all had imperative duties, or said that they had, and would do no more than assure me that the trail through the woods was very plain, running due north, and not in the least difficult for a vigorous young fellow. I started while the morning was still early, they averred. I could get to Glendale by sundown and avoid a night in the open. Even then I suspected nothing. The prospect seemed good, and I resolved to try it alone, let the lazy villagers hang back as they might. Probably I would have tried it even if I had suspected, for youth is stubborn, and from childhood I had only laughed at superstition and old wives' tales. So before the sun was high I had started off through the trees at a swinging stride, lunch in my hand, Guardian automatic in my pocket, and belt filled with crisp bills of large denominations. From the distances given me and a knowledge of my own speed, I had figured on making Glendale a little after sunset. But I knew that, even if detained overnight, through some miscalculation, I had plenty of camping experience to fall back on. Besides, my presence at my destination was not really necessary till the following noon. It was the weather that set my plans awry. As the sun rose higher, it scorched through even the thickest of the foliage, and burned up my energy at every step. By noon, my clothes were soaking with perspiration, and I felt myself faltering in spite of all my resolution. As I pushed deeper into the woods, I found the trail greatly obstructed with underbrush, and at many points nearly effaced. It must have been weeks, perhaps months, since anyone had broken his way through, and I began to wonder if I could, after all, live up to my schedule. At length, having grown very hungry, I looked for the deepest patch of shade I could find, and proceeded to eat the lunch which the hotel had prepared for me. There were some indifferent sandwiches, a piece of stale pie, and a bottle of very light wine, by no means sumptuous fare, but welcome enough to one in my state of overheated exhaustion. It was too hot for smoking to be of any solace, so I did not take out my pipe. Instead, I stretched myself at full length under the trees when my meal was done, intent on stealing a few moments' rest before commencing the last lap of my journey. I suppose I was a fool to drink that wine, for, light though it was, it proved just enough to finish the work. The sultry, oppressive day had begun. My plan called for the merest momentary relaxation, yet, with scarcely a warning yawn, I dropped off into a sound slumber. When I opened my eyes, twilight was closing in about me. A wind fanned my cheeks, restoring me quickly to full perception, and as I glanced up at the sky, I saw with apprehension that black racing clouds were leading on a solid wall of darkness prophetic of violent thunderstorm. I knew now that I could not reach Glendale before morning, but the prospect of a night in the woods, my first night of lone forest camping, became very repugnant under these trying conditions. In a moment, I decided to push along for a while at least, in the hope of finding some shelter before the tempest should break. Darkness spread over the woods like a heavy blanket. The lowering clouds grew more threatening, and the wind increased to a veritable gale. A flash of distant lightning illumined the sky, followed by an ominous rumble that seemed to hint of malign pursuit. Then I felt a drop of rain on my outstretched hand, and though still walking on automatically, resigned myself to the inevitable. Another moment and I had seen the light of a window through the trees and the darkness. Eager only for shelter, I hastened toward it. Would to God I had turned and fled. There was a sort of imperfect clearing, on the farther side of which, with its back against the primeval wood, stood a building. I had expected a shanty or log cabin, but stopped short in surprise when I beheld a neat and tasteful little house of 2 stories. Some 70 years old by its architecture, yet still in a state of repair, betokening the closest and most civilized attention. Through the small panes of one of the lower windows a bright light shone, and toward this, spurred by the impact of another raindrop, I presently hurried across the clearing, rapping loudly on the doors as soon as I gained the steps. With startling promptness my knock was answered by a deep, pleasant voice which uttered the single syllable, "Come!" Pushing open the unlocked door, I entered a shadowy hall lighted by an open doorway at the right, beyond which was a book-lined room with a gleaming window. As I closed the outer door behind me, I could not help noticing a peculiar odour about the house. A faint, elusive, scarcely definable odour, which somehow suggested animals. My host, I surmised, must be a hunter or trapper, with his business conducted on the premises. The man who had spoken sat in a capacious easy-chair beside a marble-topped centre table, a long lounging robe of grey swathing his lean form. The light from a powerful argand lamp threw his features into prominence, and as he eyed me curiously, I studied him in no less detail. He was strikingly handsome, with thin, clean-shaven face, glossy flaxen hair neatly brushed, long, regular eyebrows that met in a slanting angle above the nose, shapely ears set low and well back on the head, and large, expressive grey eyes almost luminous in their animation. When he smiled a welcome, he showed a magnificently even set of firm white teeth, and as he waved me to a chair, I was struck by the fineness of his slender hands, with their long, tapering fingers whose ruddy, almond-shaped nails were slightly curved and exquisitely manicured. I could not help wondering why a man of such engaging personality should choose the life of a recluse. "Sorry to intrude," I ventured, "but I've given up the hope of making Glendore before morning, and there's a storm coming on which sent me looking for cover." As if to corroborate my words, there came at this point a vivid flash, a crashing reverberation, and the first breaking of a torrential downpour that beat maniacally against the windows. My host seemed oblivious to the elements and flashed me another smile when he answered. His voice was soothing and well modulated, and his eyes held a calmness almost hypnotic. "You're welcome to whatever hospitality I can offer, but I'm afraid it won't be much. I've a game leg, so you'll have to do most of the waiting on yourself. If you're hungry, you'll find plenty in the kitchen. Plenty of food, if not of ceremony." It seemed to me that I could detect the slightest trace of a foreign accent in his tone, though his language was fluently correct and idiomatic. Rising to an impressive height, he leaded for the door with long, limping steps, and I noticed the huge, hairy arms that hung at his side in such curious contrast with his delicate hands. "Come," he suggested, "bring the lamp along with you. I might as well sit in the kitchen as here." I followed him into the hall and the room across it, and at his direction ransacked the woodpile in the corner and the cupboard on the wall. A few moments later, when the fire was going nicely, I asked him if I might not prepare food for both, but he courteously declined. "It's too hot to eat," he told me. "Besides, I had a bite before you came." After washing the dishes left from my lone meal, I sat down for a while, smoking my pipe contentedly. My host asked a few questions about the neighbouring villages, but lapsed into sullen taciturnity when he learned I was an outsider. As he brooded there silently, I could not help feeling a quality of strangeness in him, some subtle alienage that could hardly be analysed. I was quite certain, for one thing, that he was tolerating me because of the storm rather than welcoming me with genuine hospitality. As for the storm, it seemed almost to have spent itself. Outside it was already growing lighter, for there was a full moon behind the clouds, and the rain had dwindled to a trivial drizzle. Perhaps, I thought, I could now resume my journey after all. An idea which I suggested to my host. "Better wait till morning," he remarked. You say you're afoot, and it's a good 3 hours to Glendale. I've 2 bedrooms upstairs, and you're welcome to one of them if you care to stay." There was a sincerity in his invitation which dispelled any doubts I'd held regarding his hospitality, and I now concluded that his silences must be the result of long isolation from his fellows in this wilderness. After sitting without a word through 3 fillings of my pipe, I finally began to yawn. "It's been rather a strenuous day for me," I admitted, "and I guess I'd better be making tracks for bed. I want to be up at sunrise, and on my way." My host waved his arm toward the door, through which I could see the hall and the staircase. "Take the lamp with you," he instructed. "It's the only one I have, but I don't mind sitting in the dark, really. Half the time I don't light it at all when I'm alone. Oil is so hard to get out here, and I go to the village so seldom. Your room is the one on the right, at the head of the stairs." Taking the lamp and turning in the hall to say good night, I could see his eyes glowing almost phosphorescently in the darkened room I had left, and I was half reminded for a moment of the jungle and the circles of eyes that sometimes glow just beyond the radius of the campfire. Then I started upstairs. As I reached the 2nd floor, I could hear my host limping across the hall to the other room below, and perceived that he moved with owlish sureness despite the darkness. Truly, he had but little need of the lamp. The storm was over, and as I entered the room assigned me, I found it bright with the rays of a full moon that streamed on the bed from an uncurtained south window, blowing out the lamp and leaving the house in darkness but for the moonbeams. I sniffed at the pungent odor that rose above the scent of the kerosene, the quasi-animal odor I had noticed on first entering the place. I crossed to the window and threw it wide, breathing deep of the cool, fresh night air. When I started to undress, I paused almost instantly, recalling my money belt, still in its place about my waist. Possibly, I reflected, it would be well not to be too hasty or unguarded, for I had read of men who seized just such an opportunity to rob and even to murder the stranger within their dwelling. So, arranging the bedclothes to look as if they covered a sleeping figure, I drew the room's only chair into the concealing shadows, filled and lighted my pipe again, and sat down to rest or watch as the occasion might demand. I could not have been sitting there long when my sensitive ears caught the sound of footsteps ascending the stairs. All the old lore of robber landlords rushed on me afresh when another moment revealed that the steps were plain, loud, and careless, with no attempt at concealment. While my host's tread, as I had heard it from the head of the staircase, was a soft, limping stride. Shaking the ashes from my pipe, I slipped it in my pocket. Then seizing and drawing my automatic, I rose from the chair, tiptoed across the room and crouched tensely in a spot which the opening door would cover. The door opened, and into the shaft of moonlight stepped a man I had never seen before. Tall, broad-shouldered and distinguished, his face half hidden by a heavy, square-cut beard and his neck buried in a high black stock of a pattern long obsolete in America, he was indubitably a foreigner. How he could have entered the house without my knowledge was quite beyond me, nor could I believe for an instant that he had been concealed in either of the 2 rooms or the hall below me. As I gazed intently at him in the insidious moonbeams, it seemed to me that I could see directly through his sturdy form. But perhaps this was only an illusion that came from my shock of surprise. Noticing the disarray of the bed, but evidently missing the intended effect of occupancy, the stranger muttered something to himself in a foreign tongue, and proceeded to disrobe. Flinging his clothes into the chair I had vacated, he crept into bed, pulled the covers over him, and in a moment or 2 was breathing with the regular respiration of a sound sleeper. My first thought was to seek out my host and demand an explanation, but a second later I deemed it better to make sure that the whole incident was not a mere delusive after-effect of my wine-drugged sleep in the woods. I still felt weak and faint, and despite my recent supper was as hungry as if I had not eaten since that noonday lunch. I crossed to the bed, reached out and grasped at the shoulder of the sleeping man. Then, barely checking a cry of mad fright and dizzy astonishment, I fell back with pounding pulses and dilated eyes, for my clutching fingers had passed directly through the sleeping form and seized only the sheet below. A complete analysis of my jarred and jumbled sensations would be futile. The man was intangible, yet I could still see him there, hear his regular breathing, and watch his figure as it half-turned beneath the clothes. And then, as I was quite certain of my own madness or hypnosis, I heard other footsteps on the stairs, soft, padded, dog-like, limping footsteps, pattering up, up, up. And again that pungent animal smell, this time in redoubled volume. Dazed and dream-drowsed, I crept once more behind the protecting open door, shaken to the marrow, but now resigned to any fate known or nameless. Then into that shaft of eerie moonlight stepped the gaunt form of a great grey wolf. Limped, I should have said, for one hind foot was held in the air, as though wounded by some stray shot. The beast turned its head in my direction, and as it did so the pistol dropped from my twitching fingers and clattered unheeded to the floor. The ascending succession of horrors was fast paralyzing my will and consciousness, for the eyes that now glared toward me from that hellish head were the grey phosphorescent eyes of my host, as they had peered at me through the darkness of the kitchen. I do not yet know whether it saw me. The eyes turned from my direction to the bed, and gazed gluttonously on the spectral sleeping form there. Then the head tilted back, and from that demon throat came the most shocking ululation I have ever heard. A thick, nauseous, lupine howl that made my heart stand still. The form on the bed stirred, opened his eyes, and shrank from what he saw. The animal crouched quiveringly, and then, as the ethereal figure uttered a shriek of mortal human anguish and terror that no ghost of legend could counterfeit, sprang straight for its victim's throat, its white, firm, ever-teeth flashing in the moonlight as they closed on the jugular vein of the screaming phantasm. The scream ended in a blood-choked gurgle, and the frightened human eyes turned glassy. That scream had roused me to action, and in a second I had retrieved my automatic and emptied its entire contents into the wolfish monstrosity before me. But I heard the unhindered thud of each bullet as it embedded itself in the opposite wall. My nerves gave way. Blind fear hurled me toward the door, and blind fear prompted the one backward glance in which I saw that the wolf had sank its teeth into the body of its quarry. Then came that culminating sensory impression, and the devastating thought to which it gave birth. This was the same body I had thrust my hand through a few moments before, and yet, as I plunged down that black nightmare staircase, I could hear the crunching of bones. How I found the trail to Glendale, or how I managed to traverse it, I suppose I shall never know. I only know that sunrise found me on the hill at the edge of the woods, with the steepled village outspread below me and the blue thread of the Chautauqua sparkling in the distance. Hatless, coatless, ashen-faced, and as soaked with perspiration as if I had spent the night abroad in the storm, I hesitated to enter the village till I had recovered at least some outward semblance of composure. At last I picked my way down Hilton through the narrow streets with their flagstone sidewalks and colonial doorways, till I reached the Lafayette House, whose proprietor eyed me askance. "Where from so early, son, and why the wild look?" "I've just come through the woods from Mayfair." "You came through the Devil's Woods last night, and alone?" The old man stared with a queer look of alternate horror and incredulity. "Why not?" I countered. "I couldn't have made it in time through Pottawisset, and I had to be here not later than this noon." "And last night was full moon? My God!" He eyed me curiously. "See anything of Vasily Okranikov or the Count? Say, do I look that simple? What are you trying to do? Jolly me?" But his tone was as grave as a priest's as he replied, "You must be new to these parts, sonny. If you weren't, you'd know all about Devil's Woods and the full moon and Vasily and the rest." I felt anything but flippant, yet knew I must not seem serious after my earlier remarks. "Go on. I know you're dying to tell me. I'm like a donkey, all ears." Then he told the legend in his dry way, stripping it of vitality and convincingness through lack of colouring, detail, and atmosphere. But for me, it needed no vitality or convincingness that any poet could have given. Remember what I had witnessed, and remember that I had never heard of the tale until after I had had the experience and fled from the terror of those crunched phantom bones. There used to be quite a few Russians scattered betwixt here and Mayfair. They came after one of their nihilist troubles back in Russia. Vasily Ukranikov was one of them. A tall, thin, handsome chap with shiny yellow hair and a wonderful manner. They said, though, that he was a servant of the devil, a werewolf and eater of men. He built him a house in the woods about a third of the way from here to Mayfair, and lived all alone. Every once in a while a traveller would come out of the woods with some pretty strange tale about being chased by a big grey wolf with shining human eyes, like Ukranikov's. One night somebody took a pot shot at the wolf, and the next time the Russian came into Glendale he walked with a limp. That settled it. There wasn't any mere suspicion now, but hard facts. Then he sent to Mayfair for the Count. His name was Fedor Tehernevsky, and he had bought the old gambrel-roofed Fowler place up State Street to come out and see him. They all warned the Count, for he was a fine man and a splendid neighbour. But he said he could take care of himself all right. It was the night of the full moon. He was brave as they make 'em, and all he did was to tell some men he had around the place to follow him to Vasily's if he didn't show up in decent time. They did. And you tell me, Sonny, that you've been through those woods at night. Sure, I tell you. I try to appear nonchalant. I'm no count, and here I am to tell the tale. But what did the men find at O'Chronikov's house? They found the Count's mangled body, Sanna, and a gaunt grey wolf hovering over it with blood-slavering jaws. You can guess who the wolf was. And folks do say that at every full moon, but Sanna, didn't you see or hear anything? Not a thing, Pop. And say, what became of the wolf, or Vasily Ukranikov? Why, son, they killed it, filled it full of lead and buried it in the house and then burned the place down. You know, all this was 60 years ago when I was a little shaver, but I remember it as if 'twas yesterday. I turned away with a shrug of my shoulders. It was all so quaint and silly and artificial in the full light of day. But sometimes, when I am alone after dark in waste places, and hear the demon echoes of those screams and snarls, and that detestable crunching of bones, I shudder again at the memory of that eldritch night. Here ends the curse of the Teak-Wood Devil. Its tale of horror is full. I have brought it here to this bridge to throw it into the river before it brings more misery into the world. I don't wonder that you look amazed at me, sir, for I am much changed since you last saw me, a scant 2 months ago. I am no longer the same woman, for the power of the Teak-Wood Shrine has dragged me through hell. See how the Teak-Wood Devil grins, how the little rubies of its eyes shine. Do you think it does not know what it has done to me? That it is merely a dead thing of wood and precious stones? It knows only too well. It has turned my hair white and lined my face with suffering. I have forgotten how to smile. Oh, no, sir, I would rather you did not take it into your hands. Let me hurl it over the railing. Let me destroy it at once. No, I beseech you, sir. Not for all the wealth of the world would I give this jewelled shrine away. It can cause nothing but unhappiness and troubled thoughts, thoughts so terrible that only death can chase them away. No person has ever looked into this shrine and lived, save only me and one other. But he was a holy man of India, and I am dying. My sands are running out rapidly. I shall welcome death. This is the Shrine Devil. See how sleek and yellow it is, how fat and smiling. Was it carved thus, think you, to quell suspicion and invite the unfortunate possessor to touch the ruby that opens the sliding door? How unctuously that little idol guards its terrible secret. $1,000? No, sir. Not for 50,000 would I sell it to you, nor for 50 times 50,000. Money cannot buy happiness for me. But grief and suffering would attend you if I gave you this shrine. The secret locked in its heart would drive you mad. If death failed to hunt you out, you would go in search of it, for the secret is not to be born. I have looked into the shrine, and I still live, but that is because of my prayers before I touched the jewel that released the little panel. Woe is me that I prayed, for had I not prayed, I might now be dead, and therefore happy, instead of slowly drowning in the welter of misery that rises ever higher about me. A holy man of India gave the shrine to a Christian bishop who had done him a great service. "Ask and you shall receive," he said, but he fell upon his knees and begged release from his promise when the bishop demanded this little teakwood shrine. "The bishop knows not what he asks," said the holy man. "Fain would I grant him anything but this, for it will bring him misery and ruin." "Nay, by my holy faith," said the bishop, "since you have asked me to choose, and it is no small service I have done you, I will be satisfied with nothing else but the shrine. I shall annul the power of the shrine, deal with the Christian prayer, and show you once more the impotency of pagan charms." "Bishop, bishop," answered the holy man very gravely, "it will take a potent spell indeed to chain the fat devil of the Teak-Wood Shrine, and until you find that potent spell, I conjure you not to examine the shrine too closely, lest you touch by chance the little jewel push-bottle that opens the door to the mystery within it, for then you will be lost utterly." "Tonight," said the bishop, "I shall open it." "Nay," said the holy man, "if I thought you were not jesting, I would kill you now, and count myself your benefactor as having saved you from misery the like of which you cannot dream exists." So the bishop gave his promise that he would not open the shrine. For months the Teak-Wood devil smiled at him from behind the big Bible in his study, and wrought him no manner of harm at all, for he had not pressed the ruby that opens the sliding door. Then, one day, guests came to the bishop's house, and he told them the story of the shrine, even as I have related it to you. One of them took it into his hands, and curiously examined the jewels that were embedded in the teak. As he examined it, his face turned ghastly pale, and he stared like a man whose eyes are fixed open in death. For by chance he had touched the ruby and opened the sliding door. Then he uttered a laugh, so mirthless, so terrible, that one of the women shrieked and fainted dead away. It was plain that the man was a maniac. The bishop took from his hands the shrine, and touched in his turn the revealing ruby. The panel slid back again, and the bishop found himself looking into the interior of the shrine. "There is nothing here at all," he exclaimed, "but McCrae has gone mad from terror." Then suddenly the bishop's face went white as he realized what he had seen. He sank to his knees and prayed. McCrae broke away from the group and ran to his lodgings in the English quarter of that native village. When they went for him, he lay dead on the floor, grasping tightly in his hand the revolver with which he had slain himself. The bishop never ceased to cry out for death, and he passed away in delirium within a week. There was in the bishop's household a native servant who had listened to his master's recital and witnessed the tragic results of opening the shrine. He determined to possess the treasure because of the jewels that shone between the yellow hands of the image. The servant was very cautious, for he feared lest he might himself experience the agony of soul that had killed the bishop and caused McCrae to slay himself. He visited a seer, therefore, and paid 10 rupees for a spell to bind the Teak-Wood devil. Then the servant took the shrine from the bishop's study and fled with it to Singapore, where he tried to dispose of it. But the shops all turned against him and offered him little or nothing for his treasure, for they said the jewels were of no value. Disconsolate, the servant took the shrine between his knees and tried to dig out the rubies that lay between the hands of the guardian image, for he thought they must be large and perfect. Inadvertently, he touched the ruby push-bottle, and the panel slid back for an instant, and he saw the mystery. His heart was troubled, but he did not understand what he had seen. This was because of the spell put upon him by the seer. Because he had not understood, he explored the mystery again, and the door slid back a second time. And now he knew. The power of the incantation was exhausted, for it was purchased with stolen rupees. A veil fell away from the servant's eyes, and he saw into the shrine with a clear brain and full understanding of what he looked upon. He knew now why poor McCrae had killed himself, and why the bishop had prayed for death. Concealing the shrine in a fold of his sash, the servant went down to the waterfront to cast it away. He stood on the wharf and watched a liner about to move away across the ocean. A great envy fell upon him of all those people, because they were ignorant of the secret hidden in the shrine, and could therefore still be happy. With this envy came also a great wave of self-pity, for the Teak-Wood devil was scourging his brain, and he knew that he could never smile again. Then he took the terrible thing from his sash to throw it into the sea. The jewels that were the eyes of the Teak-Wood image threw out a strange light, and an American, hurrying to board the ship, stopped with a shrill whistle and demanded to see the curious object. The servant refused, but the American persisted, and offered much money for the treasure. The man shook his head sadly, and told the American the whole history of the shrine, as he had heard it from the bishop, even as I have repeated it to you. The American forced into the servant's hands a roll of bills, and rushed up the gangplank with the shrine in his arms, for the men on the ship were calling to him. The servant waved the bills at him frantically, and struggled to follow him, but the deckhands stopped him, The gangplank was pulled up, and the liner moved slowly away. The American dived into his stateroom and concealed the object in the covers of his berth. Then he returned to the deck. A crowd was gathered on the dock, and there was a great commotion, but of the bishop's servant there was no sign. He had jumped into the sea. The American was John Aubrey, my late master, who first told me the story of the shrine on his return from India. He told me the tale again 2 months ago, with madness gleaming from his eyes, and begged me to destroy the thing, to throw it into the river, to let it sink where human eyes would never more look upon it. You were my master's friend, and to you I can talk. It was this Teak-Wood Shrine that killed him. He took it from the mantel to show it to me. Disbelieving its power, disbelieving the entire story told him by the bishop's servant at Singapore, for he had been unable to find the hidden spring of the shrine. He suddenly, by an evil chance, pressed the ruby, and the panel slid open. He tried to prevent it from closing, and inserted the nail of his little finger, but the door slid back into place, notwithstanding, after he had caught a fleeting glimpse into the very heart of the shrine. He laughed triumphantly to think he had at last found the touch-stubber. He was as excited as a small boy over his discovery. That was because he did not yet know what he had seen. But soon he began to worry, and his face grew slowly more and more drawn, as the terrible truth began to take hold of his brain. His eyes filled with dread. His brows contracted in horror. He made me promise to destroy the shrine. Then he went to his room and locked the door. I concealed the object which I now hated with all my soul, for I wanted no more misery brought into the world by its hideous means. I was called at the inquest with the other servants, but I told only what the others told, about how we heard the shot and broke open the door, and found our master lying dead on the floor of his bedroom. But of the Teak-Wood Shrine and the hidden panel, and the fat devil with the wooden belly and the ruby eyes, I said not a word to anybody. And then I prayed, God, how I prayed, that unto me it might be given to release the world from this horror. Then I touched the ruby, and saw what it was that the Teak-Wood image was guarding so complacently. It is because of my prayers that I am undergoing this life in death, this burden of misery, instead of being happy in the grave. It must be an answer to my prayers that today I have the strength to bring the shrine to this bridge, to throw it into the muddy waters. When that is done, I shall be ready to die. My life is ebbing, and I am moving swiftly to my grave. I have read the Teak-Wood Devil's secret, and all the sweetness and light have gone from my life. Give me back the shrine, sir, or else fling it with your own hands, at once and forever into the blessed depths of the water. No, no, sir, you must not look for the jewel. At once fling it, or you will be yourself its victim. Oh, oh, you have done it, you have looked. What horrid sound is that? You laugh, but that is because you do not yet know. Now, do you begin to realize? You know now what I have suffered. You have entered upon the path that can end only in death. Oh, 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 help me, you at the end of the bridge. Oh, gentlemen, hurry, that is where they sank. Look, they are going down for the 3rd time. They are lost, they are gone. He and the Teak-Wood Devil. Heaven be thanked. And now, sirs, you may take me away. To a hospital, or an asylum for the insane. It matters not where, for my days are numbered. Nothing matters any more, for the curse of the Teak-Wood Devil is ended. Good sirs, take me away. I have lived beyond my 80 years and 10. If 70 years is the maximum age allotted to man, then the timekeeper has allowed 13 more to slip by without ringing the bell. Why? I do not know. Age is the old man's armour. Because of his age, he is pardoned for thinking that the best men and women lived 50 years ago when he was in his prime. After these admissions, if it occurs to you that I am overstating the strength of body and other qualifications of my friend Chadwell's and myself, kindly remember that I sit in retrospection, day after day, rehearsing in my mind, over and over, the episode that was enacted 50 years ago. It is past my understanding that I did not become insane, as did Chadwell's. Perhaps I was as strong physically as Chad was back in those days, but I never even claimed or pretended, although I was mannish and somewhat given to self-exaltation at that age, to be as fearless as he was. Many times have I heard old Wilbur Brownlee say of him, "That fool ain't scared of man, beast, or devil," and I always thought the strong assertion well justified. Strange things happen in this world. 42 years ago, Chad Wells died, hopelessly insane, in the Pineville Asylum. He had been an inmate for 7 years and 5 months when death kindly ended his miserable life. Yes, strange things happen in this world. Here I am, 83 years old, yet I was no stronger physically and not as fearless, as was Chad when that thing began coming into our tent at night. I can now see the twisted legs and the drawn feet of that thing. It was something that dragged itself along on its rump, pulling and clawing with crab-like claws and toes. Its hind feet were used in scratching its nose, and were used that night in an attempt to hide its face from us, or to shield it from the light of the candle that Chad held in his trembling hands. Well do I know that I shall be criticized for calling it that thing, but as I am the only living human, unless that thing be a human, who knows what caused Chad Wells to become insane, and since I am writing of this episode that has never been told heretofore, I must put it down straight. Although my own mind becomes confused, and I often realize that I am thinking of that thing as if it were a man, there are other times when I can think of it only as a demon from hell. I know, as did old man Wilbur Brownlee, that Chad Wells was not scared of man, beast, or devil, but Chad was scared of that thing. And he was so uncontrollably frightened that greenish-white froth exuded from the corners of his mouth and trickled upon his chin and seemed to cling there, as foam collects against a snag in a swollen stream. All of which I could see as he held the lighted candle just above his head, peering at the crouching, cringing form of that thing. Like most old men, I am getting ahead of my story. There are many persons younger than I am who will remember when the Louisiana, Texas and Gulf Railroad was built through South Louisiana to the Gulf of Mexico. They also remember a great many of the weird tales that have been told about Jean Lafitte and his crew of pirates, that made boat transportation along the Gulf Coast very hazardous for many years. They recall the stories about the treasures that were buried in the cypress brakes of South Louisiana by the adventurous Frenchmen, and how that pirate, although cruel, always brought the bodies of the poor victims of his pillaging crew to the shore and buried them. Jean Lafitte, himself conducting some kind of burial rite at the time of interment. 50 years ago that country was replete with stories of romance and adventure. Attention is called to these facts in order to admit to you that Chad and I were continually hearing these fantastic stories, and that our minds were receptive and impressionable while we were in that section of the state, surveying out the right-of-way for the Louisiana, Texas, and Gulf Railroad. And the first night that thing came into our tent, I almost reached a conclusion that I had seen my first ghost. But 2 nights later, I knew without doubt that it was not a ghost. I take it that the strongest believer in the mysterious and the occult will admit that ghosts and spirits do not scratch, claw, bite, or strike with a club. Nor have I ever heard anyone claim that ghosts would curse and swear in 2 different languages when physical pain was inflicted upon them. That thing cursed Chad and me that night in language both English and French that I dare not set down, even in my personal and private memoir. Such vile epithets as I had never heard before, nor have I heard since, came shrieking from the sputtering lips of that thing as he, or it, sprang into the air, clawing and scratching and biting and striking. It fought more like some wild bird, such as I have never seen, but how I imagine one would fight if defending its life. I have since seen cocks fight, and they reminded me of the way that thing fought. However, there was something these fowls could not get into their mellies that thing was past master at, such as striking and clawing with all of its 4 feet while in mid-air, and actually biting at one at the same time. Then it would drop to the ground upon its rump, bouncing therefrom into the air, where something mysterious seemed to suspend it, thwarting the law of gravity. It seems impossible for me to write out this episode coherently and with continuity, but I am determined that the nephews and nieces of Chad Wells shall know what killed him, or at least what drove him insane. If this document is to be found among my papers after I am dead and gone, I sincerely hope it will be published, for many there are who will be glad to know that Chad Wells was not guilty of any mental or physical abuse that destroyed his mind. However, I do believe that Chad could have, by force of will, driven the horrors of those nights out of his mind, I did, which no doubt accounts for my living beyond my 70 years. Never have I mentioned those 3 nights of that thing to a living soul, nor have I ever before penned one line about anything pertaining to those experiences that redirected my course in life. For no man can be the same normal, nonchalant, devil-may-care person after encountering some death-dealing, soul-torturing creature of the devil. Poor old Truebuck, he was my deer hound. When I awoke that first night and heard him whining and howling, I instantly knew that something was wrong. Although Truebuck was a deer hound, he was also a good watchdog. He was my friend and protector. I got up to go to him because I thought he was suffering, but when I got out of my bunk, something right close to me began to chatter and sputter. I sat down upon my bunk because I was not familiar with such sounds and was playing for time in order to clear my brain from the dullness of sleep. That thing became more tranquil when I sat down, but it continued to make a noise, like the rasping sound made by a frightened bat, at the same time crunching its teeth together as a sleeping child does when bad dreams are making it restless. I could hear Chad's deep rhythmical breathing, and I knew that he was sleeping soundly. Therefore, to disturb him would be inconsiderate, when I knew full well he was fatigued from many miles of walking. Therefore, I sat quietly for perhaps 10 minutes. Then that thing began to move about in the tent. Chad's old-time knapsack was hanging on a nail that he had driven into one of the tent stays. In this knapsack were some portions of venison, some corn hoe cakes, and 2 or more baked sweet potatoes, this food being Chad's lunch for the following day. It was our custom before retiring at night to prepare our lunch for the next day, and to place it in our knapsacks in readiness for an early start the next morning. As I sat there on the side of my bunk, contemplating the proper and brave thing to do, for I must now admit that I was somewhat frightened, that thing moved over to the tent stay, took Chad's knapsack off the nail, and began eating that lunch. As I write down these notes, my eardrums seem to quiver at the sound of that thing munching and crunching upon Chad's lunch. If the memory of those sounds still affects my eardrums after the lapse of 50 years, think, will you, what the effect must have been there in the darkness of that tent 50 years ago. Several weeks have passed since I wrote the foregoing. The last paragraph was written late at night. It must have been the sudden coming of the norther, the moaning of the wind, and the howling of a dog that affected me. I lay in my bed positively ashamed of my cowardice. My nerves were in a frenzy. I prayed for sleep, but none came. I could hear nothing but that thing munching and crunching upon those bones that it had taken out of Chad's knapsack. Then I happened to think, in mockery, of how foolish it was for me to be affected by something that happened 50 years ago. I began to cheer myself with the fact that I had warded off this thing for 50 years by sheer power of will, and that it was absurd for me to lose my nerve when perhaps that creature of the devil was long since dead, and its spirit, God! Its spirit! Where was the spirit of that thing if it were dead? Then I remembered that I did not believe in ghosts, and so remembering, I decided to laugh out loud and strong in order to reassure myself. But when I laughed, it was not my laugh. It was the chattering sputter and the rasping squeak of that thing. I have not thought of this story that I am writing for several weeks, because I abandoned all thought of that thing until I could get my nerves out of the kinks. Although I let a moaning wind and a howling dog and too much concentration on this episode of 50 years ago get me down, I am determined to continue. I shall write out this episode to its finish. I am quite sure my strong determination will keep me from losing my mental equilibrium again, and I apologize for the break in my story, brought about by my sudden weakness. Especially is this annoying to me, when in the beginning I asked pardon for any probable egotism that might flare up in the telling of this episode. I sat there on the side of my bunk, contemplating the propriety of shooting this intruder. Had I been in the tent alone, I know that I would have shot that thing, or at least I would have tried, because at the time nothing had caused me to believe it to be anything but some strange, wild animal of the swamp country. Would it not be the act of a coward to shoot a living creature while not knowing what it was? Would Chad do such a thing? No, positively. I knew that he would not, nor would he have me do such a thing. Should I call Chad and let him find me trembling with fear? Let him discover that the cause of my agitation was overwrought imagination, struggling to make something uncanny out of a predatory animal? The proper thing for me to do, the thing that Chad would do under similar circumstances, was to catch this nocturnal visitor and hold it until a candle or a pine torch could be lighted. Before giving my mind time to change the course of my determined action, I quickly arose from my bunk and quietly walked over to where that thing was munching away on Chad's lunch. I could have touched it. I could have grabbed it. But when I got within reach of that thing, my courage melted away and I stood weak and quivering. That thing was ravenously hungry, for it had not heard my approaching footsteps. However, it must have suddenly heard my pounding heart, for in the twinkling of an eye it darted under the tent, at the same time grabbing me about the ankles and jerking my feet from under me. I must have hit the hard-pressed ground under the edge of the tent with tremendous force, for I was knocked unconscious. Minutes or hours later, I do not know which, I began to hear faintly the sound of an axe. Gradually familiar noises began clearing my brain, and I could hear the sturdy blows of Chad's axe, chopping upon the hard, dry oak limbs that we had accumulated for cooking fuel. I sat up and tried to look about me, but my eyeballs turned in their sockets, and my head whirled in a dizzy haze. I stretched out on the ground again, and then opened my eyes to learn that day was breaking. Old True Buck arose, stretched himself and yawned, then walked over to me and licked my face. This act of kindness helped my mind to adjust itself to my surroundings. While sitting there on the ground about 50 feet away from the tent, I attempted to recall the happenings of the hideous night that had just passed. Fragments of incoherent fact were gathered together and pondered over until my memory became clear up to the time that thing grabbed my ankles and jerked my feet from under me. As I was thus engrossed in meditation, Chad called me to get ready for breakfast. Evidently he had not discovered that I was absent from my bunk when he got up and left the tent to cook breakfast. Our established rule was to alternate by weeks in our cooking duties. That is to say, Chad would cook all meals one week, and I would take over the culinary duties the following week. This was Chad's week to cook. For some reason I was glad that Chad had not noticed my empty bunk before he left the tent, and that he had evidently not seen me lying upon the ground. Of course, it had been dark when he slipped into his trousers and boots. The trite expression that it is always darkest just before the dawn no doubt originated with some old-time camper, and it was at this time that one of us crawled out each morning to boil the coffee, heat the fresh meat, and cook cornbread in an open skillet. I was also glad that the tent was between the spot where I was sitting and the place where Chad had a hot fire around the cooking stones, upon which rested the crude cooking utensils. These situations enabled me to slip into the tent for my trousers and boots. Of course, it is unnecessary for me to explain that men in those days, who lived entirely out of doors, removed but few of their clothes when retiring to their bunks at night. Therefore it was necessary for me to put on only my trousers and boots, and I was dressed for the day. When I went to wash my face and hands in the little brook that supplied our camp with sufficient water, I found a bruise upon my left cheek and a worse one on my head. The one on my head was entirely hidden by my long, unkempt hair, but the one on my cheek must have been quite noticeable. I did not seem to know then, nor can I explain now, why I wanted to hide from Chad all the happenings of the night before, but I remember distinctly that I hoped Chad would not pay enough attention to the bruise on my face to ask any questions about it. Bruises and scratches and cuts were scarcely noticed by men who lived in the woods in those days, and it was quite satisfying to me when Chad failed to mention the blue spot that decorated the left side of my face. Although Chad was not much of a talker, I was convinced before the day ended that he knew nothing of the visit of that thing the night before. I artfully suggested subjects calculated to cause him to mention anything unusual that he might have heard, had he been disturbed by the antics and the strange noises of that thing. What I must now admit stings me keenly. When the sun began to drop behind the dense canebrakes and cast dark shadows beyond the tall cypress trees, I began to dread the oncoming night. When the evening breeze from the Gulf of Mexico began blowing through the long streamers of grey Spanish moss to tangle and weave them about the small twigs to which they clung, and the sombre silhouettes from these moving tresses began stealthily stealing about in front of me and over me, I admit it, I was a coward. I dared not return to that tent. Instead, I dwelt upon the importance of a letter that I must post, even though it necessitated my walking 9 miles to the nearest post office and back the next morning in time for work. The following morning, when I returned to camp, Chad was drinking coffee and eating cold cornbread. He scarcely greeted me when I said, "Good morning, Chad," and sat down upon a block of wood that I used at mealtime for a chair. His right eye was bloodshot, and I noticed that the muscles in that side of his face twitched at irregular intervals. The veins across his temples bulged out, bold and prominent, the blue of them exaggerating their size. He held his coffee cup clasped between both hands. I wondered why. He replaced the cup upon the crude table with both hands. He bit hungrily at the pone of cornbread that he picked up immediately after releasing the cup. I needed nothing more to tell me that Chad Wells had experienced a bad night, and that he was in worse condition than I was after walking 18 miles to and from the post office, following a night of torment with that thing. "Chad," I said, trying to break a silence that was becoming uncomfortable, "the Atchafalaya is rising several inches a day and has been for the past week. Backwater up the Red is pushing into her, with all the tributaries of both rivers pouring Arkansas rains into her. Wouldn't be surprised if we aren't run out of here." Chad attempted to answer me as he reached for his coffee cup with one hand. That hand trembled like one with palsy. Then I knew why Chad was handling his cup with both hands. His voice was high-pitched and unnatural. First, it embarrassed him for me to ask questions. Then I could see that it angered him, and having consideration for my good friend and compassion upon him while in this condition, I desisted from any attempt at conversation during the entire day. He made no attempt to talk to me, nor did he utter a word until we had returned to the tent late that evening, when he suddenly surprised me by saying, as much to the trees as to me, "This is going to be a hell of a night." I had been so absorbed in the poor condition of Chad during the day that I had quite thrown off the tormenting fear that gnawed into me all the day before. But that cold declaration of Chad's chilled me to the bone. "This is going to be a hell of a night." It brought me back to that thing. It seemed to deliver me into the clutches of that hideous, uncanny, devilish creature, munching and crunching upon the bones from Chad's lunch, making a noise like the rasping sound made by a frightened bat, chattering and sputtering. I could see it, yet I had never seen it. But there it was, with its twisted legs and drawn feet, dragging itself along on its rump, pulling and clawing with crab-like claws and toes. It had been too dark in the tent the night before for me to see it, but there it was. There it was, dragging itself. It had a head like that of a man, formed like that of a man, but there seemed to be no skin covering its face, just raw flesh, dry but bloody-looking. There it was, creeping and dragging along, with eyes glittering out of the shadows like chiseled rubies. I shrieked, a sort of command for it to stop. That thing grinned, then raked its long fingernails across its protruding teeth, making a rasping noise like that of a frightened bat. I am now where Chad Wells died. I am in the Pineville Asylum. I became insane, as did Chad Wells, but there are times when I can understand everything. I hear the doctors discussing me, and they say I have semi-lucid periods. I hear some of the nurses say, I am afraid of that wild nut. Just a little while ago, it must have been this morning, or maybe yesterday, one of them said, "Doctor, don't make me go in there. I'm afraid of that thing." Yes, that thing put me here, just as it did Chad Wells. But by all the demons of hell, I'll finish this story. I know where I left off. I was telling about that thing coming to our tent on the third night, just before dark, and I could see it plainly for the few minutes preceding, the blackness of night. I was seeing it when my nerves got into the kinks again, but I'm all right now. That thing came dragging along. I have told you how it did and how it looked. Chad trembled for a spell, a minute maybe, then he started toward that thing. It spread out flat upon the ground, with its little raw flesh head turned upward. When Chad got within a step of that thing, the little raw flesh head stretched way out like that of an angry goose, and hissed through its protruding teeth. Chad quickly kicked at the ugly head, but before he could get his foot back to the ground, that thing was in mid-air, scratching, clawing, and biting. Before Chad could strike, the hellish thing was back on its rump, ready for another spring. Chad again kicked viciously at the raw-fleshed head, but it shot sideways and upward, with those fiendish claws twisting and writhing and squirming for an opening at the man's throat. While off the ground, the protruding teeth of that thing extended far beyond its hair-covered lips, exaggerating, if such a thing were possible, the murderous appearance of this soul-destroying archangel of the devil. As much as I loved Chad, I could not force myself to go to his aid. I prayed aloud for mental and physical strength to rescue my friend and comrade from the clutches of that thing. For now the twisted legs and drawn feet and its crab-like claws were about Chad's neck and head. The protruding teeth were glistening from against the background of the raw flesh head and the hair-covered lips. They were darting forward and backward as if sparring for an opening at Chad's throat. I tried to close my mind, make it a blank. I rushed into the fray and grabbed. God! I can feel that slimy jelly-like substance now as it sloughed off that thing and quivered in my hands. I then opened my mind, I hope you get my meaning, which told me that the body and form of that hellish demon was by no means demolished or impaired by losing the quantity of slushy slime that quivered in my hands. However, I must have torn that thing from the neck and head of Chad, for it was now about to attack my friend with a heavy limb that it had grasped within its claws. Now, for the first time, Chad lost his nerve. I do not think it was because of that thing seizing the heavy limb and raising it to strike Chad, but because this monster suddenly began to curse us with language too vile to write down. That thing cursed in French and cursed in English. It was enraged. The more it cursed us, the more furious it got. When I saw Chad running, I followed him with all my might. We were only about 50 yards from our tent. I could feel that thing clawing at my back. I could hear the rasping, twanging noise of its claws being drawn across those protruding teeth. I prayed then, and I thank God now for strength to run. Although my legs seemed paralyzed and my joints seemed to be sore and stiff, I knew that I was gaining on Chad. But Chad disappeared. One moment he was just a few steps ahead of me. Now he was gone, like that. I saw him. I never took my eyes off him until he disappeared. Then something went wrong with me. I was sinking. The earth was sinking beneath me. I could feel something crawling and squirming under me. Was it that thing? No. I felt the bootlegs and knew it was Chad. Then I felt bones. The frame of a man's chest. Then I knew we had fallen into an open grave. We had seen many times a slightly sunken place in the ground, not far from the tent, and I had meant to examine it, but now I knew what it was. It was an old grave. No doubt it had once held the body of one of Jean Lafitte's victims, but now the flesh had returned to dust. The crude coffin had amalgamated with the soil, and the worms of the earth had devoured the hair, and there was nothing left but bones, just lifeless bones. I reached for Chad's bootlegs. I wanted to feel them again. I wanted to feel something that was warm with life, not cold and feeling like bones, dead bones. Instead of feeling Chad's legs, instead of feeling something warm with life, I felt something crawling and crinkling and squirming. I felt jelly, slushy slime that quivered in my fingers, and I felt claws at my throat. Then that thing began laughing and chattering. It was triumphant laughter and defiant chatter. Then it stopped and hissed. Oh, Saviour of souls, those teeth, and that rasping, twanging noise of claws being drawn across protruding teeth. I see that thing now. It is here. It is there. It is everywhere. Chad, come back, Chad. Come to your old comrade boy and help me fight. I helped you, Chad, that night when we were young. Come, Chad. Oh, too late. It has me by the throat now, dragging me and munching and crunching upon my bones. Maybe it's the bones of the man in whose grave I am lying along with that thing. My bones and his, but everything is just bones. You remember the case. The papers were full of it. It was a sordid, gruesome affair. A scrub girl was killed by a fanatic. His name was Will Hoyst. Hers was Gladys Rogers. It was known as the Hoyst-Rogers case. I was reporter for the Page, and as a sort of last horrible chapter, I was sent to see Hoyst electrocuted. He behaved disgracefully. He was as backboneless as a jellyfish. His eyes stared. His lips were positively blue. He had all the earmarks of an abject coward. I think he was the worst specimen of physical fear that I have ever seen, and in my reporter days I have witnessed many men on their short journey to the chair. The last words Hoyst ever spoke were ones familiar to me. "I didn't kill Gladdy," he protested until the end. "You ask Peter. Peter knows the truth." During the long trial he had often reiterated those sententious sentences. To us, meaningless. I knew them by heart, but I had recorded them only as the jargon of a man demented by his crime. To probe him on the subject brought nothing. He would go so far and then stop. Peter was his twin brother's name, Peter Whast, the sculptor, whose new art was the sensation of last year's art exhibit. He was found dead in his bed from heart failure 3 months before his brother, Will, became a murderer. I therefore gave little heed to Hoyst's parting words, and in my story for the next day's page I merely mentioned that he had gone to his death still protesting his innocence and implicating his deceased brother. Since that time I have stumbled upon strange things, and have, at this writing, more respect for Will Hoyst's utterances. That is why, at this late date, I am digging up this gruesome affair and turning the poor Hoyst brothers over in their graves. Strange and impossible as this story may seem, I feel duty-bound to publish it. Hoyst's name is on the blacklist, and there is only a cross with a number marking his grave. And if what I have learned can in any way exonerate him, if only in the eyes of a very few, I shall consider myself repaid. I had almost forgotten the case. Being immersed in other matters, Hoyst had gotten his judgment and fitting punishment, and that was all there was to it. It was not circumstantial evidence that had convicted him. He had been seen plunging the knife into Gladys Rogers's breast by a girl living in the flat next door. She had come forward timidly the last moment and had clinched the matter. We were all angry at the stupid creature. She was a shop girl, and fearing anything connected with cops, she had lengthened the life of the trial by holding back her valuable testimony. But you, who followed the trial in the papers, know all this. Believing thoroughly Hoyst's guilt, it annoyed me to have Jack Hayes, a fellow journalist on the Page, come bursting in on me one lunchtime at the Palace Grill and interrupt my mastication of a thick steak by exclaiming, "Remember the Hoyst case, Bert?" Jack was always abrupt and annoying, and he loved to slap people on the back, especially when they had a mouthful. I sputtered and glared at him, and when I finished coughing and getting my windpipe cleared, I said, "Of course I remember it. Don't resuscitate unpleasant memories, Jack, and, for the love of Mike, kindly refrain from hitting a man on the back when he's in the act of swallowing." "My error, Bertie," he laughingly apologized, at the same time sitting beside me in a place just vacated. He ordered a steak too, having no originality. All his stories are cut-and-dried journalism, and while he waited for the steak to fry, he told me that immediately after I had left the office, a woman had rung up the editorial room, inquiring for me. "No, you young devil," he chortled, although I had not flickered an eyelash. "It wasn't Mary Pickford asking for an interview or Lady Duff requesting you to visit her fashion show. It was only an old lady. Get it? An old lady with a cracked voice. I spoke to her myself, and she was as ancient as the hills." Here he poked me viciously in the ribs, and here I state frankly that I never did like Jack Hayes. "Well, what did she want?" I demanded, ignoring his scanty humour, if humour one could call it. "Have no false hopes, Bertie. This old crone doesn't want to leave you her fortune. She simply wants to have a confidential chat with you about the Hoy Seas. It'll be cheerful, no doubt. She says she hasn't long to live, and her one desire is to see you before the Grim Reaper cuts her down. Sounds like Eddie Poe or Annie K. Green, doesn't it? I was angry. I had dallied long enough with Will Hoyst. He was dead. Let him remain in his ignominious resting place. But why should she pick me out of the millions for her deathbed confession? I cried, pushing away my coffee cup with disgust. Check, please, waiter. I'll not bother with it. You follow it up, Jack, if you care to. I'm through with Hoyst and his whole nasty affair. I was reaching for my hat and overcoat. Jack took hold of my arm. Bertie, she said, nobody but you would do. It seems she saw you at court or read your stuff or something. Anyhow, she wants you and you only. Better follow it up, Bertie. It sounds like a wonderful story. Here's her name and address. Complete information. He shoved into my reluctant hand one of his cards, on the back of which was a hasty jotting in pencil. I did not read it then, but stuck it irritably into my overcoat pocket. So long, Jack, I said, leaving him quickly. Better take my advice, old man, he flung after me, but I pretended not to hear him. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment to light a cigarette, and fumbling for my matches, my fingers encountered Jack's card. I pulled it out and read what he had written on it. Lorna Blanchard, 2021, Hubert Street, City. Hubert Street is one of the shabbiest streets in our city. It is a pitiful street because it had once been something. It is like an old duchess in poverty. I know the street well with its grey rows of old-fashioned houses. It is a blowy street with papers and dust always flying. The street had given me many stories, most of them disagreeable. A young girl had committed suicide in one of the grey houses. There had been a murder in another house. It is rich with food for ever-hungry reporters. Perhaps the old woman did have something pithy to relate. I recalled Will Hoyst's last words, and with this new interest they had a portending sound. I walked slowly up the street trying to decide. The afternoon was mine. I had counted on walking through the park to the beach. I needed exercise. Jack had said that the woman was dying. She was most likely dead now. I detested seeing dead bodies, especially old ones. Well, all I had to do was to ask for Lorna Blanchard. If the Reaper had called before me, I could go away. Looking around to see that Jack Hayes had not followed me, he was always up to tricks. I swung onto a car and got a transfer to the old trolley line that bumps along within 2 short blocks of Hubert Street. The sun was obscured by fog from the bay when I got to Hubert Street, and the old grey houses were desolate in shadow. I had never seen the place quite as melancholy. 2021 loomed up like a great grey vault, and the iron picket fence around the small space allotted for a garden, but where no garden had bloomed for years, looked like the fences one sees around graves in old churchyards. I found to my surprise, by reading a stained placard below the doorbell, that Lorna Blanchard was a medium. She gave trumpet and cabinet demonstrations every Tuesday and Friday night. I began to imagine many reasons for this woman's summons as I rang the bell and waited for an answer. She had, of course, heard from the spirit of Will Hoyst. Or it might be Peter. I have never taken much stock in spiritualism, for I had attended many seances and had always run into tricks. These I had written for a Sunday editorial. The door did not open for some time. I became chilled by the fog and the wind that sang mournfully about the big grey house. Finally the door was opened a very small crack by someone who asked, "What do you want?" "I am Willows, reporter for the Page." "Lorna Blanchard sent for me," I said to the dim face peering at me through the crack. "Oh yes, just a moment." The door closed, and I heard slow footsteps ascending a flight of stairs. Then there was silence, and then again footsteps descending the stair. This time the door was opened wide. "Upstairs, if you please," invited a servile voice coming from an old man in seedy black who stood in the shadows, cast by a feeble gas jet. The tiny blue flame served only to illuminate the first few steps, and after that it was a case of feeling my way. The old man followed close behind me, but he said nothing, and made no apologies for the darkness. At the top of the stairs I found another dim gas jet, and a long, cold hall with countless doors opening into countless rooms. To one of these doors the old man led me, paused and knocked. He received no immediate answer, so he opened the door and looked in. A welcome rush of warm air came out to me, and I could glimpse, over the old man's head, a small iron stove with rounded, flushed cheeks like a fat man with a fever. A voice, low-pitched and musical, asked if that was Barlow. "Yes, Miss Blanchard, this is Barlow, and I've brought the man from the page." "Oh, I am glad," said the rich voice, followed by a deep sigh of relief. "Tell him to come in, Barlow." I entered a warm, high room, the one window of which had a cracked yellow shade pulled down. The place was scantily furnished. It had a few plush-bottomed chairs, a table littered with dusty volumes, dirty dishes, newspapers, and a Ouija board, a heavy oaken bureau, and a heavy oaken bed to match. That was about all. Above the bed, and staring wrathfully at me, was the crayon portrait of a fierce black-whiskered man, with a transparent veil covering the lower half of his face. Around his head were drawn moons and stars and planets. These details I had short time to notice, for my whole attention was instantly drawn to the woman, lying in the middle of the heavy oaken bed. Her face was most unusual, although so much of it had wasted away that her eyes and nose and high cheekbones were all that seemed to remain. What held me and stimulated my interest were her remarkable eyes. They were the eyes of a dead woman who was still lingering, with eyes only between life and death. They were not of this earth, and yet they still held the spark. That is not for the dead. She fixed those startling eyes upon me and said, "I was afraid you wouldn't come, Mr. Willows. You don't know how afraid I was. I am pausing between this world and the greater one to come, but the door is rapidly closing. It is a heavy black door, and I can push against it only a short time longer." I leaned over her, anxious to catch every word. She was like a well-written story, interesting from the start. "What is it you want to tell me, Miss Blanchard?" I asked. "I want to try and prove to you that poor Will Hoyst did not kill Gladys Rogers. I want to lay the guilt at the right door. Please, sit down. It is quite a long story. Tell Barlow to keep up the fire. It is cold here for you, but not for me. I am free from all that. Can you hear me? My voice used to be very loud and clear. It sounds now as if I am whispering." "I can hear you perfectly, Miss Blanchard," I said, seating myself on one of the plush-bottomed chairs. Barlow was refilling the round stove with coal, and the reflections of the flames danced on the room's stained walls. "How did you come to send for me?" I inquired. "I saw you often at different séances, and when I saw you in court I remembered your face. In your writing you were always so kind to poor Will Hoyst. You did not condemn him from the start as most of the newspaper men did." Looking back, I had been rather square with Will Hoyst, even though he did exasperate me with his weakness. I did not tell the public he had played the coward before he died. "How did you know my name?" I pursued. "I never had the pleasure of signing my stories." "The board told me that," she said, and she indicated the Ouija board on the table. Barlow had taken a seat beside the stove and sat slumped over, his shadow, huge and black, cast behind him on the bare wall. Lorna Blanchard turned her head slowly on her pillow, fixed me with her eyes, and began her strange story. "To begin with, Mr. Willows, I was nursing Mrs. Hoyst when her twin boys were born. I was not a professional nurse. In fact, my father was training me to follow in his footsteps. That is his picture over the bed. He was a wonderful man, but too far beyond us to be fully understood. I always feared him when he wore the black veil. We lived next door to Mrs. Hoyst. She was a widow, a queer, weak little woman who always leaned on me for advice. Her husband had treated her brutally and had bullied her. She had a bad habit of cringing. Perhaps you noticed that poor Will cringed too." "Yes," I said, "Will Hoyst was not a strong character. Peter and he were as different as the day and night. They were born a few months after their father had been killed in an accident. Mrs. Hoyst was alone and without funds, so my father permitted me to nurse her and be with her when her hour came. I remember the night well. There was a storm and far-off rolls of thunder. The doctor we had called in a hurry was fussy and inefficient. He made me very nervous. Will was born first, and Mrs. Hoyst, her heart failing, was almost gone. Peter was yet to be born. I saw that in a moment it would be too late. I took Mrs. Hoyst's cold hand in mine, and with all my strength. I called her back. It was part of my father's training. She came through the black door, reluctantly, for she had been given a glimpse of what was on the other side, and it had been fair to her. Peter was born while she lingered between the land of the living and the dead, just as I am lingering now. We, the doctor and I, had to work strenuously to keep Peter alive. At first we thought he was born dead. His little body was blue and cold. The doctor and I swung him around in the air, and at last succeeded in bringing the flush of life into his body. He gave a faint cry. As we laid him down beside his mother and brother, we found that Mrs. Hoyst had slipped through the black door, and had closed it forever behind her. I did not want to see the children taken to a charity institution, so I prevailed upon my father to let me take them home and care for them. My father was a man of means, and I was ready to strike out for myself in the world. I had already conversed with the dead. The twins were, from the start, the queerest children I have ever known. They were deeply interesting studies. Will was the clinging kind, just like his mother. Peter was absolutely independent. He led Will about by the nose. Will was glad to be led. He followed Peter like a dog and tried his best to obey Peter in everything. Will could never be depended upon, however, for his weakness always got the better of him during crucial moments, and Peter would have to step in and do the thing himself. As children, they played strange games down near the river that flowed through the dark woods at the rear of my father's estate. They were not popular with other children, so they played alone. Peter would invent the strange games, and Will would play with him, half the time not understanding. Yet he was not a stupid boy. I often watched them playing there, in those dark woods beside that sluggish river, and I never heard them laugh. A great deal of their queerness was my fault. I was too serious with them. My adventures in the spirit world were unconsciously conveyed to them. Peter was fond of asking questions, and often I found him with my father in precocious conversation. My father was amused by him and told me that the boy was clever, and with proper training would make a brilliant medium. Father called him Spirit Peter because he had been born while his mother lingered in the doorway. I foolishly told Peter how I had called his mother back just long enough to give him birth. That filled him with wonder and uncanny amusement. I was born while mother was as good as dead. I often heard him telling Will, and you can't imagine how terrible it sounded, and how sorry I felt because I had told him. Will would stare at him in horror, and he would go on to explain that Auntie Lorna could call people back from the dead. His eyes would grow round and pale green like cat's eyes. Will's would too. My, how they used to frighten me. They were so peculiar looking, with pale skins, white eyebrows and lashes, and straw-coloured hair. They made me think of plants growing in a cellar away from sunlight. Peter developed early the artistic talent that later made him so famous. He found, near that dark river, a red clay that was fine for moulding, and with it he would shape the figures of his mind. When only 11 years old, he brought to me his conception of his mother as a spirit, that so pleased my father that he made arrangements to send him to an art school when he became older. The next year my father died and left most of his money to a research society that he had founded. I took the twins into the city and rented a hall where I began my life's work. I carried out my father's plans and sent Peter to the best art school I could find. At 16 he won the first prize for a bust of his brother Will. During this time Will was developing along literary lines. You remember he was a contributor to a socialistic periodical at the time of the Gladys Rogers murder. He admired Peter and still looked up to him and still leaned on his judgment. One night, when Peter was away sketching in the country, I was awakened from sleep by his voice calling to me, and I felt his long fingers clutching my arm. "What do you want, Peter?" I asked. "Are you in need of me?" His voice answered me distinctly. "Call me back, Auntie Lorna. Call me back as you did my mother when I was born." I worked myself into a trance and called him back, not knowing into what harm he had fallen. 3 days later he returned, looking even paler than usual and wearing dark purple shadows under his eyes. He explained that he had been in an automobile accident and had been nearly killed. He said that if I had not come to his rescue, that he would not have lived. He limped when he walked. He kissed me and explained that he would not have minded passing had he not a great gift to give to the world. He was constantly talking about that great gift. My poor Peter. They were kind and thoughtful boys, those two queer ones. Will loved me most, and it is only of late that I have learned how real and unselfish his love was. Ah, if I had only known sooner, my poor brave Will. Here she paused and closed her eyes. A deep sigh escaped her. I saw her wasted form under the covers spasmodically quiver and then relax. "Miss Blanchard, not yet!" I cried. She faintly smiled and opened her eyes. "No, not yet, but very soon. The door is heavy. I must close it soon. Do you recollect the ruthless attack upon my religion a few years ago, when the fakers were exposed and we, who were sincere, were forced to fly from the storm of ridicule? Well, I was one of those who fled. I came to this place, and have been here ever since. Will lived with me for a time and then moved uptown. Peter had a gloomy studio on Grant Street. The two boys came to see me often, and I was not unhappy. Peter first met Gladys Rogers at a friend's studio, where she was doing the cleaning. He gave her his studio work to do more as an act of pity than anything else. I cannot see what Will found in her. She was plain and unattractive. You know that from her pictures. She had no brains either, but yet he lost his heart over her. As it often happens, she wouldn't consider the man who loved her. Her silly heart fluttered after the unattainable. It was Peter she wanted, and Peter hardly knew she was alive. He was engaged in planning his great gift to the world. He was blind to all else. I often saw Gladys puttering about the studio, and I quickly saw the situation. Wolf shamelessly neglected his writing and hung about the studio to feast his eyes on Gladys. I tried to make her appear to him in all her defects, but he was love-blind. Peter was constantly in search of a model for his great gift. He insisted upon a certain type and turned many beautiful women away. He finally decided on an exotic creature, long and as graceful as a leopard. Her eyes were grey and almond-shaped, dreaming like still mountain pools. She was stupid, but she was given to long silences and did not betray herself. She posed in the nude for Peter, and her body was the whitest I have ever seen. She looked almost transparent. Gladys, of course, became instantly jealous of Nina. She thought that because Peter chose her, that he was in love with her. Nina came every day and stood on the model's throne and scintillated like a queen, and Gladys was the little cat who looked and slunk about and did spiteful things behind Nina's back. Once I found her crying in the dressing room where Nina kept her clothes, and when I asked her what was the matter, she spoke rudely and ran away. Peter's work progressed rapidly. He seemed consumed by inward fires. He would even phone Nina at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and insist that she come down and pose. Nina always came. She was afraid of him. His gift to the world was a mystery, and always will remain one. He kept it under lock and key. I shall never forget the night when Peter came to me and told me that the great gift was ready for the world. He was the happiest man alive, poor Peter. I was very proud of him. He went back to the studio and found his great gift smashed into bits. The door had been forced open, and a mallet and chisel had done its cruel work. I think Peter almost went mad. He was never the same afterward. It was reported that he died of heart failure, but it was really his brain. He never suspected Gladys, until I foolishly suggested her. When he became convinced, he started out to find her. She had already proven her guilt by dropping out of sight. Peter lived only for revenge. His great gift had meant more to him than his life, and now that it had been ruined, there was nothing left for him but to destroy the wanton destroyer. He combed the city from top to bottom. Gladys had most likely gone to some suburban town. Peter never found her. He took to his bed, worn out, a skeleton of his former self. I went and nursed him. He prayed for God to make him strong until he had ended his search. Will came just before he passed away. He held Will's hand and fixed him with his eyes. "Will," he said, "I am dying, but you must finish my search. You must avenge me. Promise that you will find Gladys Rogers and—" He did not need to finish it, for poor Will understood. He shrank away, but Peter's old will held him and made him give the promise. Then he passed beyond the door. After the funeral, Will told me that he was going to keep his promise. This time, he told me, he would not be weak and fail. It was my duty to prevent him and inform the police, but I did not. I am a wicked woman, Mr. Willows. I had it in my power to save a human life, and I let slip the chance. Will was gone for 3 months. I never heard a word from him during all that time, and I was worried. I consulted my board, but it told me nothing. I had not had communication with Peter since his death. That was worrying me too. On the night of June 28, you know the date, Peter came back. I was sitting in my room thinking of Will. Suddenly I felt Peter's long fingers clutch my arm, and his voice asked me to call him back to earth. In obeying him, I was again dreadfully wicked. I don't know what made me so weak. It must have been my love for my boys. I called him back, and I heard him come through my room, from my cabinet, and go out the door. I called him, but he had gone. I began to cry, for I knew he had returned for his revenge. I sank into a trance and knew nothing until the next day, and then I heard of the murder of Gladys Rogers. But nothing of this came up in court, I said. Why was it you did not testify? Because Will forbade it. But I would have testified, in spite of Will. Had I known what I know now? What do you know now? I asked, for I saw that she was breathing heavily. I seemed to feel the ominous presence of the Reaper. I know now that Will did not kill Gladys. I know now that Peter did not kill her either. Gladys killed herself. Yes, don't interrupt. Will left this with me. I followed his instructions and did not open it until he was gone. She held up for me to see a few hastily written pages. In this Will has written the truth. He kept it a secret to shield me. It is really my fault that Gladys Rogers killed herself. I called Peter back. You see, on the night of June 28th, Will found Gladys in the Grayson flat. He fully intended to kill her, but his love for her and his weakness prevented him from plunging the knife. It was then that Peter was called back by me. He went and stood behind Will, and Gladys saw his spirit form. Mad with fright, she pulled down Will's upraised arm and stabbed her breast with the knife. It was this scene that the girl in the flat next door witnessed. Gladys died in Will's arms, and Peter went back to the beyond. Through me he had accomplished his end. I am the guilty one. Her wasted face turned slowly on the pillow. I could almost see the black door closing. Of course, no one will believe the story. They always said Will was insane. My religion is not considered seriously. But I know that you will present it to the world, Mr. Willows, in the best way you know how, and we will let them judge for themselves. Thank you. It is... the door, Will. Will, I'm coming. Peter. She smiled as the door closed behind her, and Barlow came up and leaned over her. She was a wonderful woman, he said, shaking his old head. Yes, very wonderful, I agreed with him as I rose to go. I felt dazed when I gained the street, and I walked for a long time and let the fog and wind blow against me. I then caught a car and rode to the office and banged this off on my typewriter. And here it is. Take it or leave it. Laugh at it or scratch your head over it, as I have done many times since. If you enjoyed these stories, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment. Thanks for listening to The Eldritch Narrator.